In this session, we will be looking at the ways in which African Christianity developed among predominantly the enslaved population in the North American colonies. At this point, until we get towards the end of the colonial period, we really aren't talking about African American Christianity, because a lot of particularly the slaves, as well as any free blacks in various places, tended to be first generation Africans. And we'll mention briefly later on why that was the case. But we are talking about predominantly African Christianity in the colonies, the North American colonies. So we'll mention some things that apply to the Caribbean as well. There were African slaves in other places as well, in Central and South America being another prominent place that they existed. About 10 million Africans were enslaved during this time, coming from a variety of places, predominantly in Western Africa. And the transformation of the African Atlantic slave trade was very important for the development, not only of Christianity, but the development of the United States and Africa as well. Now, as we begin thinking about this, it's important to kind of see this development in the context of an Atlantic world. Historians a couple of decades ago started to talk about the importance of recognizing that the colonies in North America were not extremely separated, that there were connections between Europe and the colonies in North America, and then of course with the slave trade that incorporated Africa. So the Atlantic world here really was a interconnection of these really four continents, because South America would have been important here as well. So all three of these areas are interconnected, and that's a very important development, because we can't think of any one of these places being separate, that the colonies kind of developed on their own. No, these were very closely connected places, even though separated by an ocean. It's also important to recognize that that a lot of the people in North America especially still saw themselves as being British, that as they're becoming Americans, they're still thinking of themselves as British. And John Fea emphasizes this in his book, Was America Founded as a Christian Nation? In order to answer that question, it's important to see that understanding. And so there are these connections that are very important in the development here of African Christianity. And it also suggested that, as we've kind of mentioned, that brought about some commonalities, some interconnections that are very important. And we can see this as well in the not only the Christianity that developed, but also in thinking about some of the similarities that existed between African religion, as well as the relationship with Christianity. And so we'll talk about that aspect in a little bit. Now, before we get into talking about the development of African Christianity, it's important for us to recognize that there are some challenges that we face in talking about any aspect of African religion, whether we're talking about the traditional religions practiced in Africa, or even talking about as Africans are enslaved, or as Africans kind of develop their own form of Christianity. We have a very similar problem historically, as has been expressed when we talked about Native Americans. that in one sense there is a lack of sources. Now, excuse me, um, historians in the past couple of decades have discovered more sources. They've adapted some sources, but there just isn't the same amount of sources like what we see in European Christianity, Anglo-American Christianity, and a lot of that is explained by similar types of things related to literacy. And so, that presents a challenge that that historians have just not had as much of a wealth of sources to draw from. New methodologies in the past couple decades have opened that up to thinking about, other ways to approach this historical study. A lot of work being done in anthropology, material culture studies that really broadens what we're able to understand about African traditional religions, indigenous religions, as well as the development of Christianity. A similar problem, of course, is that a lot of the sources that have been available tend to be hostile toward African religion. Christian missionaries, others coming from a Christian or European standpoint, looking very much down upon the religious practices of Africans, and so that presents a challenge to us as we think historically about that. There are more sources that are able to be drawn from for African Christianity than perhaps from some of the things with Native Americans, but we do have the opportunity in more recent years to kind of broaden some of that understanding. When we think about the beginnings here of African Christianity or modern African Christianity, now I kind of want to preface this a little bit by saying, Christianity expanded into northern Africa in the early centuries of the development of Christianity. So one of the most famous early Christian theologians is a man named Augustine. And Augustine was bishop of Carthage, Hippo, so in Africa. Tertullian, another very famous early Christian from the 2nd century, was also from Africa. Other famous Christians like Clement of Alexandria, Origen of Alexandria, were in Africa. So there was Christianity in Africa in the early centuries. Predominantly, a lot of it was limited to northern Africa along the Mediterranean coast. There was some in Egypt. Of course, in Acts chapter 8, it talks about the Ethiopian eunuch, and so there was Christianity in Ethiopia. So, there is a presence of Christianity in those early centuries. But with the spread of Islam beginning in the 7th century, a lot of that Christianity begins to decline. It's not entirely wiped out, but it is in significant decline. And so by the 17th century, when the North American African slave trade started, Africa is a mixture of predominantly traditional religions, what are often called indigenous religions, as well as Islam and some Christianity. And we'll talk more about some of those things when we think of, kind of the start of African Christianity in a modern sense. That being said, there were some commonalities between African traditional religions and Christianity. Both, and I guess I should also preface this as well as that I'm taking a very broad usage of African religions that minimizes the differences, and I'm doing that for brevity. Um, just like Native American religions, there was a lot of diversity among African religions and African religious systems. And so there wasn't an African religion. And even when Christianity becomes popular, it becomes widespread in the 19th century through missionary work. There's not an African Christianity. And so it's problematic to talk about African religion or African religions, but there are, I think, a couple of characteristics that scholars have pointed out that are similarities that I think are important to note and may have helped some of the acceptance of Christianity among Africans. Certainly, there were other factors, including enslavement and the practices of white slavers, and that has an impact on this as well. But in general, the African religions, as well as Christianity, kind of believed in two worlds. This world and another world, a more spiritual type of world. And so that's an important similarity here between these two groups in that the notion that the physical world is not all that exists. And in fact, these groups claimed that there were revelations from the other world, and that the other world shared things into this world. A couple other places where there would have been some similarities would included the notion of within a lot of African religions, of a high god who is responsible for creation. Certainly, though, a lot of African religions tended to be polytheistic or pantheistic. Polytheistic, believing in multiple gods; pantheistic, believing in kind of a spiritual power that pervades the nature, physical objects, those kind of things. And that certainly would have been an important difference between the two groups. Additionally, in a lot of African religions, there wasn't the same kind of sense of orthodoxy, there being a correct way to believe. Now, certainly by the 17th century, in a sense, we have a multitude of divisions in Christianity, and their orthodoxies are quite different. But there was still within Christianity, the different Christianities, the notion of orthodoxy. There is a correct set of doctrines. And so that even though different Christian groups had different views about what that orthodoxy was, there was still a commonality among Christian groups that there was something that was orthodox. There was an orthodox set of beliefs. Not the same kind of sense within, African American religions. Additionally, there wasn't a powerful priesthood or ministerial type of setting that enforced orthodoxy, that maintained the boundaries of what was the correct teaching. Furthermore, a lot of African religions believed in continuous revelation. I mentioned earlier, of course, that one of the similarities is this belief in revelation from the other world. Well, for a lot of Christians, that was predominantly Scripture, and Scripture was settled for a lot of them. Now, there certainly were some groups that believed in kind of a continual revelation, but in many respects, most Christians, especially Protestants, kind of looked at the revelation being complete with the completion of the Bible. Well, a lot of African religions had notions of divination, right? That you can engage in a set of practices to tell the future, but that revelation is coming from the other world. Visions, hearing voices, all of these things were things that a lot of African religions had as a part of their thought process, which made, in some respect, for some groups, the Bible hard to accept. That the Bible had happened so long in the past that there just isn't the notion of how this could be important in the present. So as we get into the 17th century, the 18th century, you have this complex encounter between Africans and Christians, where some enslaved Africans brought to the North American continent, as well as some free Africans, adopted some aspects of Christianity, incorporated that, and some of their traditional practices were incorporated as well. So, there's this complex encounter where it's not a simple notion of conversion, right? That they wholesale converted Africans, either in Africa or in the Americas. Before we talk about that development, I think it's important for us to reflect on the idea of how Europeans and those of European descent looked at African religion. And certainly, just like we saw when we were looking at Native American religion, they're viewing Christianity as the most advanced religion. Understandably so, right? Believing that this is what God had provided, and that when they looked at African religion, right, they are looking at a pagan religion. And so African religion was superstitious because of all the indigenous practices related to divination, related to protection from spirits, a variety of other things like that. African religion was also considered to be primitive. This is backwards. This is not developed. This is not advanced. And largely, just like with Native American religion, literacy was often just as much a factor in trying to, in ways in which Europeans, thought of Africans. So Europeans are approaching Africans from this type of mindset. Many of them, certainly not all of them, but many of them are approaching it from this type of mindset. And so there is a sense in which Europeans are thinking of themselves as, especially in the context of slavery, they are thinking of themselves as providing what they often refer to as the grace of faith in slavery. That essentially they're preventing them from dying as pagans. Now, certainly as a Christian, I believe that, I want everybody to accept Christianity. But certainly I do not believe, and I certainly condemn that type of notion that says, let's engage in this horrible practice in order to make them Christians. But that was kind of the mindset that existed for a lot of Europeans, was that this superstitious primitive set of religions, that one way we can Christianize them is enslaving them. It's the very problematic set of views and attitudes, even though, I support the idea of missionary work. I certainly do not support it in this way, but this is a very important factor for why slavery developed as it did. Another important question that we face when we think about African religions and the development of Christianity is how much, and as Africans became Christianized, enslaved predominantly with some free blacks, how much of African religion was retained? This has been an important question for historians for several decades. That they've thought about this question that as slaves are, or as Africans are enslaved and brought to the colonies, what of Africa are they bringing? What of Christianity are they adopting? Now, predominantly for several decades, there were kind of two basic theories about this. One was developed by a scholar named Melville Herskovits, and his view was that African religious survivals, that the things that Africans, as they were enslaved, that they held on to, those allowed them to move forward and were responsible for the creation of African American religion. Right? And so that what they're doing is they're bringing some aspects of African traditional religions, and they're using them to help them make sense of the world and incorporating Christianity with them. Another scholar, E. Franklin Frazier, argued the kind of the opposite, which was basically the idea that there isn't a prevalence of African traditions in the history of the colonies in the United States. So essentially, those are kind of abandoned. Other scholars have suggested differently. Some have suggested that over the 17th and 18th centuries, there was essentially the death of African religious systems. So, for example, a scholar named John Butler referred to this as the African spiritual Holocaust, that essentially the systems of religions, right? So the ways in which the Yoruba, right, one of the groups in Africa, in Western Africa, the way the Yoruba practice, the system of practices, died in the 17th and 18th century. That there were still individual practices from these systems that maintained themselves, or the Africans continued to hold on to these practices, but the entire system died. So if we could think about this in terms of something like Christianity, use Christianity as an example, this would be like holding on to baptism and communion, but losing everything else when it comes to Christianity. And so that's kind of what Butler was trying to argue, is that the overall system's dead, but individual practices were maintained. And that it eventually, when slave families started, you see examples of some of these systems or some of these larger groupings of practices developing again, coming into focus. Other scholars have suggested, something similar along the lines of kind of the way in which Africans made sense of the world, the way they persevered through the world, was kind of piecing together these new systems from the remnants of the old. That certainly one of the things to remember is that as Africans are enslaved and brought to the plantations and the colonies, sometimes it was people from the same group, tribe, religious system ended up on the same plantation, but often it was the case that they were often split, and so there were Africans from various groups that various tribes that ended up together. And so as that happened, historians have claimed, they kind of take a little bit of, Yoruba practice and then a little bit of practice from this other group, and they kind of, bring them together. Now, if it was the case where, though there was a group of people on a plantation that came from the same region, then it was more likely that they would maintain their traditional cultural ways, because they were able to work together. But if they were kind of spread apart, it was less likely for some of that to survive, until you start to see some slave families develop. Now, it's also important to recognize that the development of slave families was a very important change in predominantly North American slavery that made it different from the Caribbean, Central South America when it came to Africans. For a long time, in the course of the slave trade, men outnumbered women in enslavement, so that as slave ships came to the colonies from Africa, it tended to be about 2 to 1, men to women. There were women that were enslaved from Africa, but predominantly it was men. And largely, I think it was the case that, a lot of slave traders and plantation owners tended to think of, I need somebody to work now. I need I want a slave that's ready to go. And so, given the physical challenges, they tended to focus on hiring and buying male slaves. Eventually, in North America, that population ratio became more even until about the end of the slave trade. So toward the end of the 18th century, before the end of the international slave trade, there was more of an emphasis on an equal sex ratio, men and women, so that they did develop slave families, right? And so instead of focusing on the here and now, I need somebody to work my fields now, it was, well, over a long time, I want to, create this plantation and create my own workforce, And so then it was more of a focus on creating slave families through enslaving men and women. And so the slave family started, and that had some profound changes religiously. A couple other preliminary things. Predominantly through this time period that we're talking about, Christian practice tended to be predominantly European in a lot of places. Now, certainly there are some ways in which Africans are putting their stamp on Christianity. And in cases where there were black congregations or black churches, you do see more of a kind of melding, a hybridity. Certainly there seems to be in the actual practices of slaves, apart from churches, more of a hybridity or a syncretism. But there is a lot of ways in which predominantly Christianity during this time, as practiced by free blacks and slaves, is predominantly European. It is not until about 1800 that you see this great transformation of it being the development of a more African American Christianity. Because in one sense, there's not really African Americans until the middle of the 18th century. Because of what I mentioned with that's the slave trade, predominantly a lot of people are first generation Africans. And so that's an important factor to consider in this as well. Furthermore, it's important to recognize that there was a sizable portion of slaves that were Muslim. It's estimated that between 15 to 20% of slaves were practitioners of Islam. As I mentioned, Islam had spread throughout Africa, beginning in the 7th and 8th centuries through this time period we're talking about. So that is an important factor in this. It too seems to have died off or become hidden in the 18th into the early 19th century. It's more towards the middle of the 19th century and later that we start seeing it pop up more prevalently. But there there are some cases, some things that are discussed in the historical record more frequently, just kind of offhanded comments of a slave being able to write in Arabic, praying in a certain way several times a day, cases of some Africans having pieces of the Quran, things like that. And ultimately, of course, we just don't have as much of a knowledge of 17th and 18th century slavery, let alone the practice of African Americans in that. Additionally, we want to talk about, set up a couple of things within our discussion of the colonies. It's important to see that as we think about the history of the United States, right, from the colonial period into the 19th century, leading to the Civil War, certainly, there's a great transformation that takes place. Slavery was fairly widespread into the 18th century, but gradually things changed in the North and in the South. In the North, what eventually you begin to see is a transformation to being a society with slaves. Even into the 18th century and 19th century, there are slaves in the North. There are slaves in various places in the North, New York City, Boston, elsewhere. But predominantly, they're not as prevalent as in the South. And so these, the North becomes a society that includes slaves. The South, however, became a slave society. A great transformation takes place where slavery just explodes in the South, but not in the North. So it's important to realize that slavery impacted the entire colonial experience, not just the South. But certainly, as we go throughout the 18th century, it becomes much more interconnected with life in the South than it does in the North, with the North, of course, moving to get rid of slavery earlier than what happened in the South. The big change, the big factor, of course, is the existence of a cash crop. As the North shifts into more manufacturing versus being more of an agrarian society like the South is, having an enslaved population isn't as economically beneficial as it would be in the South, where there was a great amount of crops that could be harvested by a large workforce. And so having an enslaved workforce in the South made sense, as tobacco, cotton, also things like indigo and rice. It called for these large labor forces. And so instead of hiring workers, planters stayed with slaves. So there's not as much in the North, there's not as much of a economic benefit to having an enslaved workforce. It doesn't mean that the North was necessarily any less racist than the South was. There was still a lot of racism in the North. Yes, there are more abolitionists in the North, people that wanted to get rid of slavery. But it's an economic factor that drives this. And it also reflects what a lot of historians have said recently, that it's important to see enslavement as being very intertwined in the development of the United States. It's not something incidental. Now, I don't believe it's the key factor for us entirely understanding the entire history and formation of the United States, but it is so intertwined with all of that early history that we shouldn't minimize it. And we should also recognize that it's something that affects the entirety of what becomes the United States and not just the South. But there are some key factors that make it more of a Southern issue as we move on. Having said all that, let's move into thinking about African, early modern African Christianity. It's a very complex process as it developed. Certainly, as I mentioned, African Christian or African religions, African culture allowed for differing revelation, and that kind of gets carried over into African Christianity. It's also important to recognize that there were some slaves that were already Christian prior to being enslaved. That conversion started in Africa. There were individuals that were Christian that were enslaved. And so it's not something that just happens in the colonies, that they don't become Christian, or they don't encounter Christianity until they come to the Americas. No, in fact, the Christianizing process, the evangelizing process, had taken place and started in Africa. And that's an important note here, that most slaves, most Africans, especially in Central Africa, West Africa, had some knowledge of Christianity by this point. So that's important in this. Some of the earliest efforts in evangelizing had started under Catholic works. Portugal was one of the earliest, but other European countries got in there as well. Eventually, as the Portuguese went to Africa, started enslaving people, some of those slaves were taken back to Portugal. They were trained to serve as translators, and then were taken back to help the Portuguese as they're kind of trying to expand their empire, as they're engaging in these economic engagements with various African kings, etc. Then, in a sense, they are serving as missionaries. As these Catholic countries are making ties with these African kingdoms, they are serving those imperial interests as well as the interests of those Catholics that want to see conversion. And so Christianity, as it starts, early modern Christianity, as it starts in evangelizing Africa, is very much tied up with political ideas, material exchange, right? The exchange of goods, buying and selling of goods, just like we see it in Native America. Those efforts often began in the coasts, particularly the West Coast, and kind of moved then into the interior. A lot of the effort was put on converting the various African kings, and if they were successful in converting those kings, that was usually a very important step in moving toward a broader Christianizing experience. With that, though, as these Catholic missionaries are engaging in this effort, there is a lot of assimilation and hybridity of Africans taking Christian concepts, traditional concepts, fusing them together, in trying to bring about, the development of Christianity. But Africans are kind of taking these things that they believe to be useful and putting them together. An effort that develops that Catholics had used in other countries is creation of various missionary schools, attempting to educate, predominantly starting with children, with the idea being that if you can convert the children, you can then connect with the parents, or at the very least, as these children grow up, they'll be connected with the church versus their traditional religions. Often, a lot of Africans were okay with this, particularly, thinking about kings and other leaders, because of the importance of literacy, seeing literacy as a vital aspect of some of this. There was only minor success by Catholics. We mentioned already that there were African Muslims, and there were actually more African Muslims than there were Africans that became Christians, but even more than that, higher numbers followed traditional religions. So predominantly Africans followed their indigenous religions. Then there were fewer than that Muslims, but even fewer than that Christians. So there's not a great success that takes place. The greater success in missionizing Africa takes place more in the 19th century as Protestants get more involved in missionary work than what these efforts were. But this does bring to the fore that here are these Christianizing efforts that are taking place in Africa that are providing a foundation for what will take place in the colonies. As I mentioned already, a lot of Africans, as they are encountering Christianity, tend to be more pragmatic. When they looked at that, it's kind of like we're going to take the parts that are useful, then rather than accepting kind of wholesale Christianity, right? So they're not becoming, converting like we might think of, right? They're just kind of bringing these two things together, even though they might be baptized, they might take communion, they're predominantly figuring out, okay, what are the pieces here that are helpful for me or helpful for my tribe or my kingdom. Missionaries as well participated in this. And so they kind of attempted to substitute Christian practices or Christian objects like crosses for traditional ones. Very much similar to the approach taken in the Americas with Native Americans, right? You kind of create this hybridity or this syncretism by, kind of bringing these two things together. That these are the same things, or here is a way to get more power, that instead of focusing on your traditional spiritual beings, focus on these spiritual beings like Mary and the saints, etc. Now, there certainly would have been places where there wouldn't have been an allowance for that assimilation or for that hybridity. But there were definitely places where missionaries were open to that. However, when Protestants became active in missionary work in the 19th century, they did not accept this accommodation. They were very much opposed to any sort of accommodation to this. And it eventually, as the slave trade really begins to expand, the Christianity in Africa and the Christianity in the colonies really begins to diverge as well. So there's a distinction between how it develops in Africa, the small success that happens there as it historically goes on, versus what takes place in the colonies. As Africans were enslaved, brought to the colonies, eventually there started to be some questions that some people started to ask. Here are these individuals that we are holding in bondage, sometimes referred to as chattel slavery, right? There's almost a sense, these being treated like animals rather than humans. And people began to ask, well, what do we do about their souls? And we've already seen some of this. Well, one of the efforts that was made, particularly we're talking about Anglo-American efforts, Protestantism, Anglicanism predominantly, was the development of the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, particularly the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts. It was started in 1701 by a man named Thomas Bray. There were some others as well, but Bray's kind of the major force in this. Predominantly when it develops, it's focused on sending clergy, sending literature to Britain's colonies in various places, including the American colonies. Wanting a larger role, having a greater impact. And some of that included paying attention to slaves. In the 1700s, they supported over 400 people in various places. The concern that a lot of Anglicans had, especially those starting this group, is that the dissenters, right, these non-Anglican British Protestants were having too much influence. And so they wanted to kind of see the Church of England have a greater influence. They looked at Catholic missionary efforts, particularly the Jesuits, and really admired that. As the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel developed, it was very active in the lower South, South Carolina, below Georgia, the Mid-Atlantic, some, New England, some, lesser in the New England area because New England tended to be more Puritan. Bermuda, some of the other kind of Caribbean lands, and Canada. And so that was a widespread presence. And, after the Revolution, of course, the SPG started to decline in the colonies because its charter was only for British colonies. So it was only created to be in British colonies. So when the American colonies are no longer British colonies, of course, it declines. They did start some schools for slaves, trained slaves to be teachers, and some of those schools continued to exist, continue to work, even when various colonies, various states, as we're getting into the antebellum period where we have the United States, some of those schools continue to operate even when a variety of states passed laws against teaching slaves to read and write. So, there is this effort to take place. Certainly, there's an effort here to evangelize slaves, and a lot of the work that's being done is this more Anglican approach. That there's more of an effort from Anglicans than from other groups, even those groups that tended to be anti-slavery. That will change in the middle of the 18th century. But essentially here you have these efforts to start, from a Protestant standpoint, to start evangelizing slaves. But the question arose, should we baptize these Africans? And particularly, what happens when they are baptized? Because the slavers, looked at this and said, okay, do we have to set them free if they are baptized? And so planters tended to be the frequent opposition to missionary work, right? Because the concern was that they would then have to free their slaves if they became Christian. Eventually, it was decided, not surprisingly, that that baptizing slaves did not change their social status, and laws were passed in the 18th century that in many colonies that claimed just that baptism did not lead to freedom. In fact, in the colonies where the Anglicans were active, they required 2 oaths from African converts, and you had to swear that you weren't looking to be freed by being baptized, and that you would follow Anglican standards of morality. There was concerns about African marriage practices, not being monogamous, not marrying for life. At the same time, of course, here are these Anglican ministers, other Anglicans wanting to say, hey, you need to not be involved with multiple women. You can't have multiple wives. There were a few women that had multiple husbands, but predominantly it was men having multiple wives. You can't have that. You need to marry for life. They're saying all of this as planters are separating slave families. They have absolutely no concern of this man and this woman have a bond. Well, I'm selling this woman, to the upper South, to Virginia. And so there's not that concern. And a lot of slave marriages weren't recognized by law. But there's still this concern of following a certain sexual morality, even though a lot of people claiming to be Christians didn't provide the conditions where it could be observed. And so there was an effort to try and prevent this notion of baptism leading to freedom, even though certainly there were probably some slaves that still hoped that by being baptized, by becoming a Christian, that their masters would treat them better. And there certainly were cases, for example, there was a lot of sexual violence against women, against black women that were slaves, being raped, being abused by white masters. And there were some women who were Christians that brought this before the church, and the church disciplined those particular planters. So there was hope, but more often than the case, unfortunately, men got away with that. Far more often because of the way that Africans were looked upon. And turning a blind eye to the sinfulness, the violence of slavery. So there was hope. Some hoped for freedom. Some hoped that it would lead to a better condition, which sometimes, very rarely, it did. But the majority, of course, it did not. More often than not, the emphasis from missionaries was kind of pulling from what Paul's discussion about slaves obeying your masters, and so that became an important view of here's this effort to evangelize. But evangelism wasn't very successful all the time, especially in the early 18th century, for a variety of reasons. One had to do with how profitable enslavement was economically. And so, that led to planters, wanting to keep their slaves focused on work and not focused on other things like religious matters. There were the concerns about emancipation and what that would mean if, that this question, as I just mentioned, of if they become a Christian, do I have to free them? And so, the missionaries were frequently complaining to their superiors, to churches back home in Britain about, the slaveholders. And at least 6 colonies by 1706 had passed laws that said baptism didn't change the status of slaves. And so that, planters were a major obstacle to missionary efforts among the slaves. The work schedule of slaves, of course, left them very little time for religious pursuits. And in these early years, as we're talking about Africans that are being evangelized, they would have Sundays off, but that would be kind of the only day that they could do things for themselves, plant their own gardens, to provide for themselves, or relax, or other things like that. And so frequently they weren't interested in pursuing these religious endeavors, to going to religious services or going to some sort of educational type of thing. They were wanting to do their own thing since they had their time, but the rest of the time, of course, was just at the master's beck and call. So there wasn't the time for that. Furthermore, the white ministers here had a lot of time devoted towards ministering to the whites of their church, and so that gave them a pretty high workload, which meant that they didn't have as much time to engage in evangelistic activity with slaves. So there's kind of the time reality that affected both the ministers and the slaves. Beliefs about Africans. We talked about some of those views. Beliefs that they couldn't be converted, right? That they just don't have the mental capacity. Were claims that people made. They made cultural arguments against Africans and their intelligence. There were racial arguments that were made about Africans and their nature, etc. Now, when we start to see American-born slaves, right, as those slave families developed, it seems like there was less. Well, I don't want to make it, by saying that, it makes it sound greater than it was. It seems like there was more of an openness to the idea that American-born people of African descent, so African Americans, were better able to understand, right, had a different mental capacity than African-born slaves were. Certainly it's ridiculous, but that's kind of the idea, was that there's the development in the American culture provided them something that they did not have in Africa. Another obstacle was kind of more of a peer group obstacle. There were cases of people who would be rejected by the non-Christian slaves if they became Christian. You're kind of giving in to what's going on. Another big thing that prevented conversion. It was a very important barrier to evangelism, was the wicked life and the hypocrisy of masters. Why would someone want to adopt that Christianity when they're doing one thing and then they're beating their slaves, they're engaged in violence in slaves, they're raping female slaves? Why would I want to be a part of that if I'm a slave? And so that there's that. Additionally, people concerned that it would make slaves think themselves equal to whites, make them rebellious. There was a lack of clergy in the South, fewer ministers, and so that meant that the churches were larger. We kind of talked about the workload just a minute or two ago. So you have this large workload for these ministers, and so most clergy just used Sunday preaching to these large groups. So these things were very important obstacles to the evangelizing of particularly Anglicans at this time. But when we get to the middle of the 18th century and the Great Awakening, we see a different change. Out of the groups that are around at this point, the Baptists are the most successful. They're the ones that make the most impact in converting Africans. They had much more active, energetic evangelists than some other groups. There is, more of an emphasis on the emotional appeal, right? This revivalism, that it's very personally focused. It was a lot easier to establish a Baptist congregation than it was to establish some of these other things, other religious groups. And so it was a lot easier for slave Baptist congregations to develop. And then it was also easier for slaves to become evangelists, preachers themselves, at least to some extent, right? They might not be recognized as ordained preachers, but it was easier for them to become like an exhorter or a religious speaker in the Baptist church, because there wasn't as much of an emphasis on academic learning as there was in some of these other groups. And so, this led to the Baptists really becoming prominent. And really, it's the Baptist activities in the Great Awakening that are part of this. And the Great Awakening, of course, led to increased attempts to evangelize. And some of the major groups that were active in this were the Presbyterians, the Baptists, the Methodists. The Quakers were not as active in evangelizing, even though the Quakers were largely anti-slavery, but they just weren't as much evangelistic. And so there's more effort to evangelize in general, and then also evangelize African Americans. For example, Jonathan Edwards talked about having blacks in his revival crowds as well as whites. There's other revivalists that are noting blacks, both free blacks as well as slaves, being present in their crowds. They are in the South, they're in the North. And so as these Africans are converting to the Baptist Church, Methodist Church, etc., there's differing ways that this is taking place, like the recognition. Right? There were some groups that offered full fellowship to blacks that converted. Others kept them separate. There were the development of black congregations in some places. In a lot of places, they were mixed. Rarely were they fully integrated. Rarely do you see, these fully integrated churches. There are a few, but predominantly you have these mixed congregations, especially as in the South, as people became concerned about slave revolts, they wanted to make sure that they had control over what was being said. At least they thought that would be a way to control that. And really that's where you begin to see these more conversions taking place, and really beginning in the latter part of the 18th century, from 1760 on, is when you start to see an explosion of Africans and African Americans becoming part of the groups. For example, in 1786, There was 1,890 black Methodists. I believe this is Virginia, out of 18,000 Methodists. Excuse me, no, black Methodists total out of 18,791 Methodists in the colony. In 1790, there's 11,000 black Methodists. 1797, there's 12,215 black Methodists, which was about a quarter of the Methodists at that time. So, you just see this increase throughout the 18th century. In 1793, for example, about a quarter of the Baptists in the colonies, in America, in the United States, were black. That's probably a little high. That's an estimate, but still, you can see how by the end of the 18th century, these groups are greatly increasing the number of both slaves and free blacks that are a part of their group. Probably one of the most significant factors in the development of these larger numbers was the rise of black preachers. With black preachers preaching to black audiences, that was predominantly where a lot of the success took place. The Baptists and the Methodists were the most open to black preachers, and even some of these individuals were open to black preachers preaching to unconverted whites, that it wasn't just black preachers preaching to other blacks. There were cases of even preachers preaching to whites. And in fact, there were some Baptist churches that were okay with having a black preacher for the church. For example, the Portsmouth Baptist Church in Portsmouth, Virginia, in 1792, their minister left. It was a mixed congregation, and they hired a man named Josiah Bishop. Some records seem to indicate maybe he was also known as Jacob, or maybe Jacob instead of Josiah, but he was a slave, and they brought him on as the preacher. Eventually, they purchased his freedom and his freedom of his family as well. Most black preachers, however, preached to black audiences, and that was more common, although there were some cases like Portsmouth and other examples as well. Eventually, though, states passed a variety of laws against black preachers, or limiting the work of black preachers, and certainly limiting the work of black preachers among whites, but even among blacks as well. A lot of concern about inciting rebellion, inciting slave insurrections, were very much a problem. But as I mentioned, there was still segregation even in mixed congregations. There were a couple of different factors that seem to have participated in the rise of the acceptance of Christianity, and why Christianity did eventually become very prominent among African Americans. One was the decline in mortality. So as slaves predominantly increased, as the lifespan increased, there was more openness to Christianity. We've mentioned this before, but as the sex ratio became more stable, became more equal, that too had an impact, and predominantly these two factors leading to the rise of families and children. Not only did it allow for the return of some traditional African practices, it also made evangelism more successful, as people, and kind of in that first generation of African Americans, often you see some examples in the historical record of parents wanting their children to be baptized, even though they themselves aren't interested in becoming Christian. right? So there might be this notion of looking for some sort of spiritual powers, looking for some sort of spiritual benefit that they themselves don't necessarily want, but they're open to it for their families. And so, as we get into the 19th century, Christianity is much more prevalent, and that's important part of this. And then also kind of as the uh, uh, labor, as the work process changed and developed, that had a profound effect on the experience of slaves as well. I want to finish this section by just kind of providing two examples, well, three technically, of some important leaders. These are certainly by no means the only African and African American leaders, but it does reflect ways in which, the the impact here of these African American leaders who are developing. Um, Sometimes in the cases of the North, predominantly the North, but there are also some Southern leaders as well, and a lot more that we could take a look at. Let's start first by talking about the example of Richard Allen and Absalom Jones. Um, Predominantly, we'll talk more about Allen, but Jones was a part of this as well. Allen was born a slave in Philadelphia. His master was a lawyer and later became Chief Justice. He was later sold, though, along with his family to a planter in Delaware. This is while he was young. His mother and his siblings would be later sold again, and so he would be separated from his family. He converted to Methodism. Methodism, of course, was very, very active in this region, and he became determined, as a lot of uh, whites white ministers preached, that by being a Christian, that makes slaves better slaves. And so he kind of becomes convinced about this and begins teaching this. And so this allows him to bring in preachers to his fellow slaves. But eventually he hears a preacher preach that convinces him, and this is the master, convinces him that slaveholding is wrong. And so this is impacting Richard. It's impacting his master as well. But there are laws against just freeing your slaves, and so his master eventually, is kind of encouraging to purchase his freedom. And so Richard works for the revolutionary forces during the Revolutionary War. He gains enough money to purchase his freedom and takes the last name Allen. He would start preaching and traveling, preaching to whites and blacks. With Absalom Jones, he would start the Free African Society, and this was a means for blacks to help each other out economically or in other ways. Both of them continue preaching, and they gain quite a few converts. They become members of the St. George's Methodist Church in Philadelphia, but there is in that congregation a lot of tension between blacks and whites. Of course, there was a lot of effort in a lot of these churches to separate black and white audiences, with blacks either being relegated to the back or up in a balcony. Sometimes also separated between men and women, but definitely a separation between the blacks and the whites. In November of 1787, for example, some of the white trustees of the church there forced blacks from the front rows of the gallery to seats even further back, and so the black members just decide to exit the church altogether. Eventually, Allen and Jones will start the African Church out of their group with the Free African Society, so kind of moving it from a communal organization into more of a religious group, would later rename it the Bethel African Church. Well, there's a little bit of a disagreement between Allen and Jones over which denomination to associate with. Now, some of this has to do with the ways in which Methodism comes out of Anglicanism, and it's only around the time of the Revolutionary War that it becomes more of a split between the Methodist Church and the Anglican Church. Methodism starts as a movement within the Anglican Church. And so Allen and Jones kind of have some differences. Allen thinks the group should be Methodist. Jones and some others believe they should be Episcopalian. And so they split. Jones will actually eventually become the first African American Episcopal priest. He is the one on the left in your screen in the clerical garb. Allen is on the right. Eventually, some race tensions between the Bethel Church and the Methodists will kind of encourage Allen to leave the Methodist Church as well. And he will start the African Methodist Episcopal Church, sometimes referred to as the AME Church. Another important African American individual at this time, again, certainly not the only three here, but Phyllis Wheatley, we'll spend a little bit of time talking about her. Just kind of give you an example of her experience. She was kidnapped in Africa when she was very young, probably born around 1753, is sold to John and Susanna Wheatley of Boston in 1761. She is named Phyllis after the ship that brought her to the colonies. And John and Susanna, although slaveholders, raised Phyllis alongside their other children, Mary and Nathaniel Wheatley, tended to treat her more like a daughter, perhaps, than a slave. At least that's the way a lot of people talk about it. She learns to read and to write. She particularly enjoyed classical literature and poetry, and published her first poem at the age of 12. During this time, the Wheatleys were very involved in evangelicalism, and through that, Phyllis gets to meet and to correspond with some pretty important evangelical individuals, including George Whitefield. And even though Whitefield, in some of his later years, becomes very supportive of slavery, Phyllis does have a very high opinion of him and his teaching. Phyllis would publish a book of poems in 1773 entitled Poems on Various Subjects, Religious and Moral. It was published internationally. It was actually the publishing was helped by George Whitefield's patron, Selina, Countess of Huntingdon in England, was very supportive of Whitefield, and she helps Phyllis Wheatley publish this book. She is the first African American, particularly the first African American woman, to publish a book. Other things had been published by African Americans, other writings, but not a book like this. In fact, she is one of the first women to publish a book. So there's a lot of ways in which this is some important piece of literature. Her most famous poem, perhaps, is entitled On the Death of the Reverend Mr. George Whitefield. That was originally published in 1770. That makes it into the book that's pictured here. A very glowing assessment of Whitefield's life and activity. The family would free her in 1773. After the death of John and Susanna Wheatley, she has a harder life. There are plans to write a second book, but that never really comes to fruition. And is when she died in 1784, she is buried in a common grave. One of the things, though, that's reflective of both Wheatley and Allen and Jones and a lot of other African American leaders at this time, and really even we can see it up till today, is that there's this notion almost that African American religious leaders, especially, but any African American leaders, are facing this notion of having to vindicate the race. And a lot of African American leaders talked about that, kind of making a justification for them to defend Africans and African Americans. And we can see that even into today, to the notion of Black Lives Matter, right? There's this effort to emphasize, right, that there's value, that individuals have, that Black individuals have value, that they have worth, that they are not what they are often presented to be, and this is something that is quite common throughout our history. This effort that leaders believe they need, and probably in many ways they reflect that, yeah, unfortunately, there is a way in which a lot of whites do not value, certainly in the colonial period and in the antebellum period, not valuing Black lives. And so, leaders having to step up, and one of the things they have to do is to emphasize the importance of Black lives. By no means have we covered the full extent of African Christianity. But I think that it's important for us to see that we've kind of laid a foundation here for helping us later understand some of the aspects of African American Christianity we'll see predominantly in this kind of Civil War period, and then later the post-Civil War period, as this historically develops in the history of the United States.